Okay, most of us think of the apostles as models of virtue. And we don't usually think about the apostles as having flaws. And after the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2 following, they were ideal examples. And only Peter had one minor mistake, and the apostle Paul corrected him, and so far as we know, he straightened that out. And the first thing that is said about the first local church is that the disciples continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine and fellowship. But if we study the apostles' lives in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we find a less stellar performance. They didn't always get things quite right. And their biggest flaw was their weak faith. However, compared to other Jews, the apostles had a great faith. Jesus just wasn't satisfied with it, because lots of Jews never did believe in Jesus. And then there were those who followed him, who saw his miracles, but they were unsure as to whether or not he was really the Christ. And there were some who followed him and then they drew back. But from the very beginning in John chapter 1, the 12 apostles recognized Jesus as the Christ. And they stuck with him through everything that happened, of course, except for Judas, but they never turned away. Now, Jesus knew before he chose the 12 that they were ordinary men with normal character flaws, with weaknesses. And after a night in prayer, he chose them anyway. So what was different? What was special about these men? And I've used the word malleable. They were people who were willing to change. They were willing to change for Jesus. Now, I've divided the apostles' shortcomings and failures into three groups: impulsiveness, selfish ambition, and weak faith. Now, their impulsiveness expressed itself in various ways. In Mark chapter 3, verse 17, when Jesus chose the 12, he named James and John Boanerges, sons of thunder. What do you think that means? Sons of thunder. They had big, loud voices. Okay, what about their temper? I suspect that he was implying that they didn't always keep their temper in good check. So they were Boanerges. And this trait appears in Luke chapter 9. Jesus, in this example, Jesus and his disciples were going to Jerusalem through Samaria. And Jesus sent some messengers into a town of Samaria. And when the Samaritans knew that Jesus and his disciples were going to Jerusalem, they didn't accept them. They wouldn't serve them. And Luke chapter 9, verse 54 reports, "And when James and John saw this, they said, 'Lord, do you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume them, just as Elijah did?'" So you see that they were sons of thunder. But Christ rebuked them. Excuse me, let's wait a minute to get there. "You know not what manner of spirits you are. For the Son of Man did not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them." So they went on to another village. And then in Mark chapter 9, verse 38, out of the blue, John speaks to Jesus saying, "Teacher, we saw someone who does not follow us casting out demons in your name, and we forbade him because he does not follow us." Now, did John do that out of a mistaken zeal for Christ, or because of pride and prejudice? I'll let you decide that one for yourself. But Jesus rebuked him. He said, "Do not forbid him, for no one who works a miracle in my name can soon after speak evil of me." And then we have the examples of the disciples interfering in Jesus' work. When a woman of Canaan begged Jesus to heal her daughter, his disciples came and urged him, saying, "Send her away, for she cries after us." That's Matthew 15, verses 22 to 28. Later on, when the people were bringing their children to Jesus so he could lay their hands on them and pray for them, the disciples rebuked the crowd, told them not to do that, not to disturb him. But Peter had more trouble with impulsiveness than the others. In John chapter 13, when Jesus came to wash his feet, he refused at first. Said, "No, you're not going to wash my feet." And then, of course, Jesus rebuked him, and Peter gave in. Then at Jesus' arrest, Peter pulled out his sword and cut off the ear of the high priest's servant Malchus. And that was a major blunder, because he could have been arrested and put in prison, or maybe even put to death. But Jesus said, Luke chapter 22, verses 50 and 51, "Permit even this." And he touched his ear and healed him. In other words, it wasn't God's will for an apostle to be lost in that context. But after Jesus was arrested and bound, all the disciples fled. And that was impulsive fear. And you can understand that it was God's will that the apostles should escape. On the other hand, it didn't say much for their courage and their willingness to die for him. But God wanted them to be around so they could serve as witnesses later on. But self-ambition was a more serious problem among Jesus' apostles and disciples. Even after his resurrection, when they had come together, they asked him, saying, "Lord, will you at this time restore the kingdom to Israel?" Now, it's not only the fact that they were still, even after the resurrection, expecting an earthly Israelite kingdom. This also had to do with their dreams and their ambitions. And these desires and their competition created major problems. In Matthew chapter 18, verse 1, the disciples asked Jesus, "Who then is greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" Why did they want to know that? Obviously, the King Jesus is going to be the greatest. In Luke chapter 9, which is also the third year of Jesus' public ministry, verses 44 to 46, Jesus foretold that he was going to be betrayed. But the disciples didn't understand him. And the text says, "Then a dispute arose among them as to which of them would be the greatest," understood in the kingdom. So they were competing with each other. So do you see the disparity? Here Jesus is foretelling his betrayal, but the disciples really wanted to talk about who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom. In Mark chapter 9, verses 33 and 34, I forgot about Acts 1:6. As they were walking to Capernaum, they were arguing. And in town, Jesus asked them, "What was it that you disputed among yourselves on the road?" But they kept silent. For on the road they had disputed among themselves who was to be the greatest. And they were embarrassed to tell Jesus that. Then, in Luke chapter 22, right after Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper and foretold that one of them was going to betray him, verse 24 says, "Now there was a dispute among them as to which of them would be considered the greatest." So this was a long-term problem. And Jesus struggled with it to get them to let go of this desire, of this competition, this competitive desire to be the greatest. In Matthew chapter 19, verses 23 to 27, Jesus was teaching about people who were rich. He said, it is hard for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. And his disciples were greatly astonished, saying, who then can be saved? Now, why would they think that only the rich would be saved? Well, that's because they were rich. They had lots of time to study the scriptures, to study all the laws, to see what to do, what they needed to do, so that they could keep the law perfectly. Pardon me. And Jesus continued, with men this is impossible, but with God all things are possible. And then Peter answered and said to him, see, we have left all and followed you. Therefore, what shall we have? What was Peter expecting? I assume it was riches and power. In Matthew chapter 20, verses 20 and 21, we again see the ambitious spirit. Then the mother of Zebedee's sons came, asking something from him. He said to her, what do you wish? And she said to him, grant that these 2 sons of mine may sit, one on your right hand and the other on your left in your kingdom. But when the 10 heard of it, they were greatly displeased with the 2 brothers. Can you see a fight developing here? These guys were trying to get an advantage over the others. And I think that if Jesus hadn't been there, the disciples might have fought and divided and gone their own way. But Jesus was there. And he taught them humility. And he revealed to them his desire to please God. They didn't have their priorities straight, did they? And then the third area of their weakness was weak faith. And Jesus often rebuked his disciples for their weak faith. In the Sermon on the Mount, that's Matthew 5, 6, and 7. In chapter 6, verse 30, Jesus said, now if God so clothes the grass of the field, which today is and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, will he not much more clothe you, O of little faith? Now, he didn't teach this to the crowds in general. He taught this to his disciples, Matthew chapter 5, verse 1. And there is a fascinating parallel in Matthew chapter 16, verses 5 to 12. And as they were traveling, when his disciples had come to the other side of the Lake of Galilee, they saw that they had forgotten to take bread. That's Matthew 6, 5 following. Then Jesus said to them, take heed and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. And they reasoned among themselves, saying, it's because we've taken no bread. In other words, he's scolding us. But Jesus, being aware of this, said to them, O you of little faith, why do you reason among yourselves because you have brought no bread? Do you not yet understand or remember the 5 loaves of the 5,000? And how many baskets of leftovers you took up? Nor the 7 loaves of the 4,000? And how many large baskets of leftovers you took up? How was it you did not understand that I did not speak concerning bread, but to beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees? Then they understood that he did not tell them to beware of the leaven of bread, but of the doctrine of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Now, this is a very interesting thing, because I remember when I was visiting with some of my students in India and was talking with a young man, he asked me a question. He said, have you ever gone without food? And I said to him, no, except when I was too busy to eat, I've never gone without food. He said, that's very encouraging to me. He had had to fast because he didn't have food in the house. Okay? But here, he saw me And he said, okay, this man should be in good shape. Turns out I was. Because Jesus kept his promise. Now in Matthew chapter 8, verses 24 to 27, we have a special record of the apostles' weak faith. And suddenly a great tempest arose on the sea, so that the boat was covered with waves. Now, the winds can come off the mountains. The Sea of Galilee is very low. It's below sea level. And the winds coming off the mountain can dip down and dig that water up and make even 10-foot waves. And we don't need a 10-foot wave to swamp a small boat. But let's read from our text further. But he, Jesus, was asleep. Can you see that? The waves washing into the boat, and he's getting wet, and he's still keeping on sleeping. He must have been very tired. Then his disciples came and awoke him, saying, Lord, save us, we're perishing. But he said to them, why are you fearful, O you of little faith? Then he arose and rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a great calm. So the men marveled, saying, who can this be that even the winds and the sea obey him? Now, you might ask, well, why were they so afraid? And one of the reasons was because at least some of them were fishermen. And they knew the Sea of Galilee. Now, maybe they hadn't experienced storms personally, but they would have heard about them. Because these storms were very vicious. They're rare, but they can make a lot of trouble, and they can make a boat sink. You have to keep on bailing out the water to make sure. So, why did Jesus rebuke his disciples for their fear? They should have known that God would never let his son die in a storm. They knew his miraculous power. They themselves would do miracles in chapter 10, but they had not recognized how far Jesus' power extended, how many things he could control. In Matthew 14, verses 22 to 33, we have a second storm, and this happened after Jesus fed the 5,000. Now, this wasn't as bad a storm, but the disciples were struggling with it. They were rowing against the wind, and the wind was contrary. Now, after feeding the 5,000, Jesus immediately made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he sent the multitudes away. But the boat was now in the middle of the sea, 4 or 5 miles in, tossed by the waves, for the wind was contrary. Now in the 4th watch of the night, about 3 o'clock in the morning, Jesus went to them walking on the sea. And Mark and Luke say that he intended to pass by. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, it's a ghost. And they shouted out for fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, be of good cheer. It is I. Do not be afraid. Well, then Peter answered Jesus and said, Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you on the water. And he said, come. And when Peter had come down out of the boat, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. You've got to keep that clear in your mind. He started to make progress. But when he saw the wind was boisterous, he was afraid. Well, the wind wasn't just boisterous, the waves were chopping up. And he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, saying, Lord, save me. And immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and caught him, and said to him, O you of little faith, why did you doubt? And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. Then those who were in the boat came and worshiped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Now, this is a big step forward for them. They're beginning to understand who Jesus is, but despite their growth in faith, they really didn't understand what it meant for Jesus to be the Son of God. And the following events show that. Because in Matthew chapter 12, the Pharisees and Jesus had a big argument about the disciples breaking the Sabbath law. But of course, Jesus defended his disciples. He always won these Sabbath debates. But in Matthew chapter 15, a new kind of problem arose. Some scribes and Pharisees had come to them from Jerusalem. Now, if they came from Jerusalem, that means they came from the top Pharisaic leaders. They were there to investigate. And they accused Jesus' disciples of violating the tradition of the elders by eating with unwashed hands. Now, according to my notes for the study I did, they had a two-handled cup. And they would take the cup, full of water, understood, and they would pour water 3 times over the right hand, and then switch hands and pour water 3 times over the left hand to remove the spirit of impurity after sleeping or after they'd been to the market, because maybe they touched something unclean. So I don't know whether they used just 1 cup of water, whether they used more than that, it doesn't matter. They had this custom. And Jesus' disciples weren't following it. And they were upset about that. Well, Jesus didn't refute their false doctrine. This law, this idea that they had now washing of hands was in the law of Moses, but not what they did. He replied, "Why do you transgress the commandment of God because of your tradition?" He attacked their tradition. And he rebuked them for the tradition of korban. Now, the word korban simply means a sacrifice. But it came to be associated with the idea that people would dedicate certain fields or certain property or certain animals to God. Now, they began to do this in order to avoid helping their parents who came to them for help. In other words, when they said, we need some help, and they say, "Well, I don't have anything for you." And if they asked, "Why not?" "Well, I've dedicated all this to God, so I can't give it to you." And so they dishonored their parents. This is Matthew 15, verses 3 to 6. Then Christ condemned the scribes and Pharisees by quoting and applying Isaiah 29, verse 13 to them. "These people draw near to me with their mouth and honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men." So we understand that Jesus condemned them, but apparently the disciples didn't, because verse 12 says, "Then his disciples came and said to him, 'Do you not know that the Pharisees were offended when they heard this saying?'" Why do you think the disciples rebuked Jesus? Do you think they wanted the Pharisees' support? Did they think they needed the Pharisees to help them so they could establish the kingdom? I don't know. But Jesus exposed these Pharisees as false teachers. And referring to the parables of Matthew chapter 13, the parable of the seed, he said, "Every plant which my heavenly Father has not planted will be uprooted. Let them alone. They are blind leaders of the blind." And if the blind lead the blind, both will fall into the ditch. Matthew chapter 15, verses 13 and 14. But the disciples didn't understand this, in spite of how plainly Jesus said this. It wasn't until such passages as Matthew 23 and others, of course, when Jesus attacked the Pharisees for their false doctrine, that they realized the Pharisees must be false teachers. Why didn't they believe Jesus? Beyond this, the apostles' greatest failure was disbelieving Jesus' predictions of his betrayal and death. And I think we all know Matthew 16, where Jesus promised to build his church. And then in verse 21, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and be killed and be raised the third day. Then Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, "Far be it from you, Lord, this shall not happen to you." Matthew 16, 21 and 22. Why did Peter oppose Jesus so openly here? I mean, this was a kind of rebellion. I think it was because all the Jews expected Jesus to set up an earthly Israelite kingdom. And do dead men set up kingdoms? No. You need a living king who will go to war and defeat the enemy and win land and power and so on. So not normally would you expect a king to die. And so it appears that Peter's human wisdom rejected Jesus' truth. You think we still have some of that problem around today? We do, don't we? So Christ had to rebuke Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan. You are an offense to me, for you're not mindful of the things of God, but of the things of men." So in other words, you're using human wisdom, not God's wisdom. And after teaching on his discipleship, Jesus promised the 12, "Assuredly I say to you, there are some standing here who shall not taste death till they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." That's Matthew 16, 22, 23, and 28. Now, do you see what Jesus foretold? He said, some of you won't die. He indicated someone was going to die, but that most of them wouldn't. And so these examples of weak faith show up 3 times in Matthew chapter 17. Now Jesus and Peter, James, and John, 3 apostles, climbed a mountain, and God glorified Jesus there. Now you can understand that after Peter rebuked Jesus for predicting his death, that the disciples were struggling in their faith. They not only didn't want him to die, they thought it was impossible for him to die. And so God glorified Jesus to help the disciples realize that he was who he said he was. And when Peter saw Moses and Elijah talking with Jesus, Peter just had to say something. And so he proposed building 3 tents or tabernacles to honor these greatest of prophets. But God, somehow that got out of order. God was displeased with Peter, and he rebuked him, saying, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Hear him." That's Matthew 17, 1-5. And after they came down the mountain, that's one example of weak faith, After coming off the mountain, they met a crowd. And a man came to Jesus complaining that he had asked the disciples to heal his epileptic son, but they couldn't heal him. Now, of course, what we're supposed to understand is that in Matthew chapter 10, when Jesus sent out the apostles, he gave them miraculous powers. And they healed people. They cast out demons. And so in Matthew chapter 17 here, they tried to heal this epileptic boy because they'd done it before. Then Jesus answered and said to the man, said to his disciples, "O faithless and perverse generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I bear with you? Bring him here to me." And Jesus healed him. And then the disciples asked why they couldn't heal the boy. And what does Jesus answer? Because of your unbelief. And I don't want to go into exactly what they should have done. The point was, they hadn't paid attention and they weren't thinking like Jesus. In verse 22, we have another example. Now, while they were staying in Galilee, Jesus said to them, "The Son of Man is about to be betrayed into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And the third day he will be raised up." And they were exceedingly sorrowful. Why were they sorrowful? Because they didn't understand what was going on. Maybe they thought something was wrong with Jesus. But after Jesus had rebuked Peter so sternly, nobody was going to stand up and deny or oppose what Jesus said. They were afraid to. And then in Luke chapter 18, verses 31 to 34, we have a parallel event where Jesus foretold his death and resurrection. And verse 34 says, "But the disciples understood none of these things. This saying was hidden from them, and they did not know the things which were spoken." Then at the Last Supper in Matthew chapter 26, verses 21 and 22, when Christ again foretold his betrayal, this time the disciples took it seriously. And they were exceedingly sorrowful, and each began to say to him, "Lord, is it I?" So they made some progress. Now, why did the apostles find it so hard to believe that Jesus was really going to die? Well, 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 7 and 8 says that God kept Jesus' death a mystery. But was that the only cause of their weakness of faith? Mark chapter 6, verse 52 says the disciples did not understand the miracle of the 5 loaves because their heart was hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. That's Hebrews chapter 3, verse 13. In Mark chapter 8, verse 17, Jesus rebuked them. "Why do you reason because you have brought no bread? Do you not yet perceive nor understand? Is your heart still hardened?" So it wasn't just the mystery. The disciples had fixed their heart on certain things and wouldn't give them up. And so their hearts were hardened and they couldn't understand. They were blinded. Now, the disciples were earthly minded. They thought about physical bread and physical leaven. But Jesus used it as a poetic image to mean the Pharisees and Sadducees' false teachings that we noted a few minutes ago. But becoming spiritually minded is much more difficult than it appears on the surface. It's real easy to get confused between spiritual laws and physical laws until you've really learned what the spiritual laws are. In Mark chapter 16, verse 14, after his resurrection, Jesus rebuked their unbelief and hardness of heart because they did not believe those who had seen him after he had risen. So they met the witnesses. They met eyewitnesses who had seen Jesus alive from the dead. And they didn't believe them until Jesus actually appeared to them and proved to them by his wounds that he was really alive. And then we have the example of Peter's struggle with pride and self-reliance in Matthew chapter 26, verses 31 to 35. In that passage, Jesus used an Old Testament prophecy, Zechariah 13:7, to foretell them that the shepherd would be struck and they would be scattered like sheep. And what was Peter's response to them after Jesus foretold that Peter would deny him 3 times? And Peter said, "Even if I have to die with you, I will not deny you." And so said all the disciples. Peter wasn't the only one. They all felt the same way as Peter. So Jesus prayed for Peter's faith. And in Luke chapter 22, verse 32, the Lord said, "Simon, Simon, indeed Satan has asked for you that he may sift you as wheat. But I have prayed for you that your faith should not fail. And when you have returned to me, strengthen your brethren." So Jesus was so sure of Peter that he not only foretold his fall, but also his repentance. And after Peter had denied Jesus 3 times, and the cock crew, and Jesus looked across the room at him, or the courtyard, whatever, Peter came to his senses. And he went out and he wept bitterly. So we assume that Peter repented of his brashness and self-confidence and resolved to really do God's will instead of his own. But that change does not explain everything that happened. What happened after Pentecost that the apostles gained such great faith? You remember that when Jesus was arrested, the apostles ran away, which was God's will, but they were afraid. And they were staying in a locked room. And they were afraid that they were going to be arrested and put to death when Jesus appeared to them. So how did their faith change so greatly that on the day of Pentecost, Peter and all the 12 stood up before a crowd of thousands and accused them and said, "You killed the Son of God." And they brought 3,000 to repentance. Where did they get this boldness? They were ideal prophets. Now, please remember that it wasn't just becoming a prophet that changed their hearts, because in Matthew chapter 10 and Luke 9, the same event really, the apostles were given power to cast out demons and to heal the sick. And they went out and preached or prophesied, and they healed the sick. So they knew that they had done these things, and yet the change came only after Pentecost. So what was it that made such a big change? The first thing that made the change was Jesus' death. That was a great shock to them. It stunned them because their dreams and expectations were turned upside down. Nothing seemed to make sense to them. because they had misinterpreted the messianic prophecies. And his death appeared to be a total failure. The Jews won. Jesus died. They had to stop and rethink everything that they believed. And in Luke chapter 24, verses 19 to 22, we have the record of the two men or two disciples walking to Emmaus, and they explained how confused they were. And Jesus asked them what they were discussing. And they answered, "The things concerning Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed before God. The chief priests and our rulers crucified him, but we were hoping that it was he who was going to redeem Israel. And today is the third day since these things happened. Yes, and certain women of our company who arrived at the tomb early astonished us. They did not find his body. And they came saying that they had also seen a vision of angels who said he was alive." But they didn't believe them until later. So they were very confused by Jesus' death, and that changed their faith. Secondly, the apostles' faith was changed because Jesus revealed the mystery to them. And the mystery, of course, is that Jesus had to die for our sins and establish a spiritual kingdom. We don't know when the apostles understood the mystery, but we know that they grasped or understood the mystery in Acts chapter 2, because Peter preached that Jesus was resurrected to sit down on David's throne. And they couldn't have understood that beforehand. They also knew that the disciples should work together as an ecclesia, as an earthly outpost of the kingdom. People even today struggle to understand how the church and the kingdom go together. But the disciples caught a hold of it. And they taught the disciples all about Jesus and how to be like him and how to live as God's children. And then the disciples' faith changed when they really, truly understood that Jesus is deity, that he came in the flesh, that he fulfilled all righteousness, that he did everything justly, and he lived a sinless life. They would have remembered that they had doubted him, that they hadn't believed everything he taught them, that they had even rebuked him as if he had lied. Can you imagine how they felt? Can you imagine how embarrassed they were, or even ashamed by the way they had treated him sometimes? So their faith changed because they really knew the truth about Jesus' deity. Of course, we still have that problem today. People preach that Jesus is deity, then they turn around and they don't accept what Jesus said to do or his apostles said to do, and they do something else because that's what they want to do. The apostles' faith also changed because they became spiritually minded. The Jewish belief that Jesus would set up an earthly kingdom had confused them, but they did know that they were fighting a war against Satan and false teachers, but they didn't understand what a spiritual kingdom would be like. That was a big mystery to them. How do you set up an eternal kingdom? How do you establish the kingdom of heaven? And when you first hear the question, no answers show up, right? But if you think about it, you'll remember what Jesus did to establish the kingdom. And the disciples' faith changed through the change of the covenants, the change of the laws. They no longer followed the law of Moses in the Old Covenant, the Ten Commandments. They followed the New Covenant, where God's law is written in our minds and in our hearts, and where God changes our hearts through His Word. And the disciples now desired to please God. Why was it so important to please God? Because they wanted to go to heaven and see Jesus. They also wanted to go to heaven and live with God. So instead of trying to gain power on earth, they set their eyes on heaven and on Jesus. This desire became the dominant factor in their faith. I hope this study helped you to recognize the power of Jesus' gospel. If you have understood how weak the apostles' and disciples' faith was, and then you compare it to how strong their faith was from the day of Pentecost onward, you know that the change in their faith was all due to the gospel of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection, and the other doctrines that we just discussed. Living with Jesus changed the apostles' faith, but His death completely changed their faith. And in all of this, look how patient Jesus was. He just kept on rebuking them. He just kept on warning them. He just kept on doing God's will. So do you think that God and Jesus are going to be patient with us when He sees our weaknesses and our flaws and our foolishness? You know that He will be. But He wants everyone to change and be like His disciples and His apostles, who were ready to die for Him and who literally did die for Him. And I hope that God will bless us to gain a greater faith in Jesus through this study. There you go. I hope this study helps us to recognize the power of the gospel of Jesus Christ and look at how the apostles' faith changed through living with Jesus. Thank you for your attention.